Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPad Air 3 and see how this specific device holds up in 2023. Now, this iPad I think is still completely worth buying for the most part. If you want to go ahead and pick it up, links will be down in the description. You can get that from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, on the outside of the iPad Air 3, this iPad did come out in 2019. So it's approaching 4 years old, and in fact it's almost exactly 4 years old since this iPad came out. And I think this was one of those devices that Apple pushed out in 2019 where there was like a week of just a new Apple products. It was one of the more interesting things I've ever seen Apple do, and it was just kind of like mind-boggling. There were rumors that there's going to be a new iPad and new AirPods, and Apple ended up doing all of that, which was so awesome. So on the outside of the iPad Air 3, on the front, you can see that it looks like another iPad. The iPad Pro 2nd generation, the 10.5-inch one, this one ended up recycling that body, which was pretty cool. I like that a lot, but it did take out a few features, which was actually on the display. So in this one, we had a 10.5-inch IPS LCD panel, and overall, I think it looked pretty good. There wasn't really a lot to complain about here. It was a pretty good panel. This was around the time, like right after we had that, bezel-less kind of iPad with the iPad Pro 3rd generation. So it definitely looked a little bit more older than the current iPad Pro, but it still looked like a really good iPad. We had True Tone on the front. The only issue with this type of iPad was that they did take out that ProMotion 120Hz display. So the iPad Pro, the one before this, actually ended up having it, and the current iPad Pro had it, but this one didn't have it. So that was kind of a sad thing. I think it's understandable for the iPad Air, the cheaper one, to not have it, but it was like a feature they had to remove, which just kind of didn't really sit right with me, but whatever, it's not that big of a deal. You still had, a little bit of bezel around it, and you had that home button on the front with Touch ID. Like I always said, I love Touch ID, and I like how they still have it on the current iPad Airs. But on the front of this thing, this doesn't look like a pretty decent iPad Air during that time. So in terms of the front, I'll definitely say still gets a thumbs up for me. Now you have that Lightning port at the bottom, which is totally fine. Still love Lightning, even though we had USB-C during this time on some iPads. Totally okay. You had a headphone jack on this iPad too, which was great. And on the back of this thing, we had that standard aluminum back. So again, just like every other iPad before this, it had, kind of like a curved side, so no flat edges on this iPad. And this was probably one of the iPads that sold the least amount of time, because I think in 2020, this iPad ended up getting refreshed. But the iPad before this, the iPad Air 2, only lasted the iPad Air 2 lasted for like 5 or 4 years. Like it lasted from like 2014 or 2015 all the way up until this one. So this one probably had one of the shorter lifespans of any iPad Air. Then the iPad Air 4 came out, that also had kind of a short lifespan. So it's funny that they're refreshing these iPad Airs quite a bit compared to what they used to do. So I like the iPad Air lineup, and I think this iPad lineup for the most part covered pretty well what, like a middle ground iPad should have been. So I definitely like that. I think the only thing Apple could have done at this moment to make this that much better of a deal was to give it a ProMotion display, but they still haven't done that on any iPad Air. So I think it's understandable. They're not going to just, announce that on this iPad Air from 2019, but they might end up bringing it on the next iPad. So in terms of the outside though, that kind of covers it up for the most part. Now, honing down in that camera department, this thing did have that 8 megapixel standard camera on the back, and it also had a 7 megapixel standard camera on the front. Now this camera is pretty much almost on par with like an iPhone 6 camera on the back and something like an iPhone 6S camera on the front. It definitely wasn't the best camera of all time, but again, it's not supposed to be. It's a camera on an iPad, so it's not supposed to be the most expensive, best camera you can get. And if you did want that, you would go up to something like an iPad Pro 3rd generation during this moment. So on this iPad, if you're wanting to, if you're a student and you're just wanting to go and take some pictures here and there, like your, whiteboard or of lecture or whatever, this is going to be probably okay. But even then, if you're sitting really far away from a lecture, you're going to be zooming in. It's going to be very grainy. Your iPhone, if you have an iPhone 7 or newer, that camera in your pocket is going to be better than this thing. So it makes very little sense to even look at this type of iPad. It's almost like a side effect of getting this iPad. It's like, oh, you're getting a pretty good iPad, but this thing does have a really weird camera. So I wouldn't depend on this thing at all. But it's nice that it has it, and I do have to give Apple a lot of credit for giving an okay camera on their iPads during this moment. So that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of software and longevity, this type of iPad, to be honest, we are again sitting at a very kind of interesting spot with this type of iPad, where it's not really the best, like the first iPad in terms of software support that I think of, but it's still supported with software, and it's probably still going to be supported with software maybe for the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even longer than that. So although this iPad isn't just getting started with software support, it's still going to be here for a little bit of time. So I think that's a really cool thing we have going for this iPad. I always look back at some other iPads that Apple made, and although those ones, they don't have the most amount of features sometimes compared to iPhones with each iPadOS update, I still have to say that, Apple did a great job when they supported the iPad Air 2. They supported that thing for many, many years longer than it should have. And since this is almost like the direct successor of that iPad, I have to kind of think to myself that Apple's probably going to be doing an even better job possibly with this one. And even though this thing has the same chipset as some other iPhones, I think it's probably going to last longer, or at least just as long as those other iPhones that have the same chipset as this one. So I think from that perspective, this iPad kind of gets a thumbs up for me too. Now in the performance side, this device has that Apple A12 Bionic chip inside of it with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now I think the RAM amount is kind of okay, but even now we're getting we're getting iPhones with like 6 gigabytes of RAM. So like it is kind of I wouldn't say it's an issue, but we're starting to creep up in that area where an iPad that has half the amount of RAM as the baseline iPhone right now is starting to going to start showing its age. I think for now it's still okay. But very soon, as these games get bigger and bigger and bigger, we're just going to be running into issues time and time again where some of these devices are just not going to be as optimized in that RAM standpoint. But I think even that's not a big deal. But I do think the A12 Bionic chip is still perfectly fine for the most part. I think, this thing still has the same chipset as the iPhone X or an iPhone XS. So we're not really going to be getting like that much slower of a version here. In terms of this iPad, I think this iPad is still plenty of fast, and when this iPad came out, it had the same chipset as that current iPhone. So even though this wasn't the iPad Pro during that time, for it having the same chipset as that iPhone at that moment, I think that was pretty cool, and I think that deserves a lot of credit from Apple as well, since they usually give like a more outdated chipset for their iPad Airs or their other iPads. I'm glad they didn't do it in this specific situation. So if you're wanting to play, kind of intensive games and apps and whatnot, I think this is going to be fine. You're really not going to be complaining too much about it. But if you're wanting to take it up a notch and you do want to play massive intensive games, of course that might run into more issues and you may have to tune down the graphics a little bit. But I think for a majority of people out there, getting an iPad like the iPad Air 3, if you're not planning on doing anything super crazy, I think this might be okay for a lot of people out there, to be honest. Like, I've definitely used iPads and iPhones that have older chipsets than this thing, and for the most part, it still kind of handles things pretty decently. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there as well. And the battery life standpoint, this thing had a massive size battery, 8,134 milliamp hours. That's a pretty big size battery to have on a device like this too. So I think that deserves a lot of credit on this device too. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is, I definitely do think that the iPad Air 3, it is still worth it for sure, but I don't think it'd be the first iPad I would recommend people to buy. I think that iPad Air 4, the one right after this, was such a good iPad, and that thing made so much sense to me that probably would be the iPad I would recommend a majority of people to buy. It wouldn't be, again, the first one I'd recommend, but it would definitely be an iPad I would recommend buying, over this thing. I definitely do think an iPad like 9th generation, if you want something a little bit more recent, that might be one you could recommend too, I would recommend buying. It looks kind of like this thing too, it's not too far off, and that thing's still supported with software, that one's still pretty good too. So that might be one I would recommend more than this thing as well. So that kind of covers it up for the most part. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.